looking for today spiritually. It's good to have some time together, take an honest look at what is happening in our hearts, and as we live our lives of faith in God. I think this is a common search, for the only way that I will really know what you are looking for is by hearing from each of you something of what is going on in your hearts. I think this can be a wonderful occasion to broaden our experience of human life, to enrich our awareness of our common human search. We really do have deep longings in each of our hearts. And to tap into these and to share them expands our consciousness of what is really happening in our world and its most promising future. Well, there is a lot of longing going on in our hearts. We don't take much time to think about the nature of this longing, what we are really looking for, or where it is coming from. So I hope in this time together, we will expand our awareness of what is going on deep down within us, and realize the wonderful potential each of us has for experiencing it, a fulfillment we have not yet allowed ourselves to have until this time. I include myself in this search, for our lives are meant to enrich one another all along each of our journeys. There are a lot of ways I could approach this effort to share with you the deep longings of the human heart. But the one I'm going to talk about is out of my own human and religious experience. I grew up in a Catholic Christian family. My father was a born Catholic. My mother became one from a Baptist background. After meeting my father and his sharing with her some of his faith experience. Early on in my own life, I had some religious experience in a family of 5 children. One that stands out for me is that I can never forget the time my older 2 brothers and 1 older sister left for school one September morning when I was only 5 years old. I remember feeling abandoned, lying in bed crying, and God visiting me with a loving sense of His presence. All at once, I knew of a divine reality that I had heard about from others, but had never experienced as real and meaningful as I did at that moment. And it's kind of interesting how that moment is still right there present in my consciousness. I can just, still, when I reflect back on it, just, sense where I was and how that happened. I had heard a lot about God, things that were said at home, but never did I really know what God was about until the divine presence touched my life. Many of you here may have had a moment like this, and it would be a wonderful thing to share it if you are at ease doing so. There were other moments like this but let me touch only on a couple of them. When in the 7th grade, a vocational director from the Capuchin Franciscan order, we had Capuchins in our parish, Franciscans who were the priests in our parish, this vocational director came to my parish in Ohio and wanted to talk to anyone who had thought of possibly becoming a priest or a religious. I had thought about this, so I went to see him. And the moment I sat down with him, I experienced him as Christ, calling me to become a priest. So a couple years later, I entered the Capuchin Seminary at Herman, Pennsylvania, where I spent the next 6 years of my life, except for summer vacation time at home. The other experience I wanted to share with was that the other experience I had was that of my 3rd year in seminary, when I read the autobiography of Saint Therese of Lisieux, The Story of a Soul. Reading this book opened up my whole mind, my heart, the whole expanse of the interior life. The possibility of a close, even intimate relationship with God. I can honestly say this is what led to my pursuing monastic life and living it for all these years. I was planning to become a Capuchin, but then in my 5th year I met a friend and we started reading Thomas Merton. Well, Thomas Merton was a monk of this monastery. And anyway, but it was Therese that kind of opened my interior sense of the interior journey. What I feel was realized in my own life's journey is something that each of you may be realizing and or are experiencing. One way of explaining this spiritual search is what St. Bernard, one of the early writers of the Cistercian order I'm in, sees as coming from the fact that each and all of us have been made in the image and likeness of God. From the moment of our creation, we are a reflection of God's own life, made with a potential of sharing the very life of God. At the moment we were conceived in our mother's womb, we were given ability to develop or become children of God, sharers in the divine life. St. Bernard sees this taking place at 4 stages. The first stage is loving ourselves for the sake of ourselves. And I asked myself, well, what's a good experience of that? Well, if I'm overeating and burdened with weight, I may have the good sense to stop doing that and say, and that's, just using common sense, it's loving God, or loving myself for my own sake. Then there comes loving God for our own sake. We realize that if we're really going to pursue the spiritual life, we need God's help. Then loving God for the sake of God. I think once we get a real sense of God, like I think today's Sunday, the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd is someone who cares about us and leads us into pasture, wants us to to enjoy life and to know God's love and develop into our full potential. Then there's loving ourselves for God's sake. And that means, when the fourth stage is where, once we have a real sense of God, then we realize that everything we do can serve our love for God. So that is kind of loving ourselves for God's sake. Where one realizes one's full potential as a child of God. Where it is no longer we who live, but Christ who lives in us. A book I have been reading, and one that I would highly recommend to anyone interested, is that by Michael Voigt, called The Fourth Degree of Prayer. And he goes deeply into each of these stages of the spiritual growth and shares with us a whole variety of religious experience that I think any of you may find helpful in understanding his or her own religious experience. He has come here to Gethsemani and spoken to our community about the life and spirituality of St. Bernard, and is a member of the lay Cistercians, who have formed groups in different states, women and men seeking to use aspects of our way of life for their own spiritual growth. There is a lot I could say more about the spiritual growth along this path we are all on, to one degree or another. It is the path that gives the deepest meaning to each of our lives. And hopefully, in our sharing about each of our journeys, will be wonderfully enriching for each of you gathered here this afternoon. Anyway, those are my reflections, and I'm interested in anything that may have triggered, or anything you would like to question about what I've said. If there's any time we wanted to have a break, we could have that too. But I'd just like to be open to any questions you have.
I'll give you a question.
Sure.
So who's your favorite saint out of all of them?
There's a part of me that, the present Pope chose the St. Francis as his name, and it wasn't Francis Xavier, who was a Jesuit, but Francis of Assisi. And I must say, early on, being exposed to St. Francis, I must say I've had from the beginning a great admiration of the intensity of his spiritual life. He died only at 46 or 48, something like that. But there was kind of a complete gift of himself. I think one who really fell in love with Christ and really experienced the presence of Christ in his life, so that it consumed him. And there have been different stories of saints, and not too long ago, and I agree with it. In terms of saints who have walked the path of Jesus, Francis comes as close as you will find. And there is, his poverty, his complete dependence on God's grace. And it comes to mind as I'm saying this that and we had it in the readings today that if St. Paul's saying, if you're threatened, don't threaten in return. Don't. And I know St. Francis, he at one point was ousted by some members of his own community. But when he walked away, he said to her brother who was with him, "Let us count this perfect joy." And here's what I felt in total detachment, someone who was so filled with the love of God that even when he was rejected, would not reject in turn. And anyway, I do have great admiration for St. Francis. I also have, I've read the stories of a lot of saints. And I think, there's no one saint that kind of gives the total picture. I do, as I did share with you, Saint Therese, she's certainly one of my favorite because of the way she touched my life by the story of the soul. And with just the intensity, again, of her love of Christ and where that took her, to endure a lot of interior struggle, and it was all kind of hidden, and then dying so young of tuberculosis. And anyway, I say I have a lot of admiration for her, and I just do think, one of the things about her, she wasn't intent on becoming a great saint. What she learned is that if we're loving in everyday lives, you all have occasions, be loving and caring with one another. And I just think, that's where real holiness shows itself. It's often in the hidden acts. I think many, I get upset with the monks sometimes because if you have to clean up in the refectory, sugar will be poured, and crumbs will be left all over, and you just would think come on, you can clean up. But they've had mothers and sisters that always cleaned up after them. And I thought we don't realize how much, mothers and women have done to make life at home happy and decently clean. And so I do think there's the hidden life. And in many ways, what I see, in monastic life, we have occasion to be loving all day long if we're attentive. We're really sensitive to one another. It's amazing what we can do in terms of service and just being caring. And I think that makes the world of difference.
So which monk is the messiest eater? Which one do you think makes the biggest mess?
Who's that?
When you're cleaning the refectory, who do you think is the messiest eater? Which monk?
You don't expect me to name anybody. Yeah, there's some are not careful, and then there are some. Our brother Frederick, he just turned 100, in the last day of March, and I know when he pours sugar into his coffee in the morning, he can't quite see or handle things, and I suspect that's part of the mess. And then again, there are different needs, and I don't know if you all have done any of you have done the Myers-Briggs test, but one of them is if you're sensate or intuitive, and I've taken the test, and I'm sensate, which means I'm very sensitive to things around me, like the messes that are left. And some of the brothers just don't even see them. And anyway, we have different gifts,
What's your typical day like? Like, I've seen your schedule of your prayer times, but what's your typical day like?
Yeah, right. Well, we get up early, we get up 3 o'clock in the morning. Of course, we go to bed early, and that helps us to get up early. And we have the first prayer time together is at 3:15. And that lasts about 45 minutes or an hour, 45 minutes, 40 or 45 minutes usually. And then after that, we have time for prayer and meditation. And so usually the office ends around 4, a little bit before 4 o'clock. But then we have from 4 to 5:45 to do spiritual reading and to just spend time in prayer. And people use that different. It's also when you can go take breakfast. And our breakfast is fairly simple. On a Sunday we'll have some cake or something special out there. But usually it's just a matter of bread and peanut butter and jelly. It's very simple, and it can be fixed up ahead of time. Anyway, then at 5:45 we have the Office of Laws, and that lasts about a half hour. And then after that we have the Mass. We have daily Mass each day. And that begins at 6:15 and lasts until about 7, or a little 5 minutes before 7. And after that is there time for just Thanksgiving, time for prayer. And then Terce is at 7:30. And then after that we have morning work. And a lot of different jobs in the house. We do a lot of different things. And I say I help in the fudge department, getting ingredients together. But then there's those who make the fruit cake, and they got to get all the stuff ready and going. And they have to clean a lot of machinery. And then there's the shipping department. Chase can tell you all about a lot of this.
Yep. I work here, for those who don't know.
But others, they're working in a factory, or, we clean the house. We do our own cooking. Or we do have one outsider now who helps in the kitchen regularly. So he's helpful. He will prepare the salads and stuff. But for the most part, the monks we do our own cooking. One of the things I do and enjoy a lot, I'm a beekeeper. So I take delight in working with bees. I wasn't very long when I first entered. I first entered a monastery actually in Virginia. They had something like 30 hives. I wasn't there very long when they asked me if I wanted to learn beekeeping. And I said, sure. So I've been at it a long time. Even when I was in Venezuela, they had the Brazilian, or the very aggressive bees, you just didn't get near the hives unless you were totally protected. Anyway, even then I enjoyed that work with the bees. And what other, just a lot of things. It's a fairly large monastery. We're down to, 36 monks. When I came, there were like 112 or 115. So, it's not.
Have you ever got stung by a bee?
Never. Almost every time I go out and work with them. I don't wear any protection now. I won't wear a hood. And if I'm careful with the bees, they leave me alone. If I'm gentle with the bees, they're very gentle with me. If I start to be careless and moving these frames and crush them, what happens with bees? If you crush a few bees, the bees that get hurt give off what's called a pheromone, which means it's a chemical that tells the other bees someone's invading the hive, and then they'll start to go after you. But if you, in fact, you can go on YouTube. There's there's a woman beekeeper. She has bees all over her. She can do anything and not get stung. And it is that I do get stung, pretty regularly, again, if I'm not careful. And sometimes the bees have their moods, after a cold night, I go in too early in the hive. They're just more easily agitated and respond. So, yes, I've been stung. But actually, I remember when I came to the monastery, our brother Jerome was in charge of the bees. And he suffered terribly from arthritis. And the theory at the time is if you get stung by bees, it will help your arthritis. And so he used to deliberately do things to get stung. and he claimed, that really did help him. And the bee gum is very strong. It's stronger than rattlesnake poison. It just that you get such a little bit of it. But it does give you a real sting. Any other questions?
Are you allergic to anything?
Allergic? Is that your question? Are you, am I allergic to anything? Well, only one, they use some chemical or a pill I took, or it was a shot, I think, called Messiest, and I had a strong reaction. I was getting an operation. But yeah, some people are very allergic, and in fact, there's one of the brothers, my brother Joseph, who wants to be a beekeeper, but he's got some allergic reaction to bee sting.
I'm allergic to red moss stings.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we have to be careful. Yeah. Yeah, no, it can be dangerous.
So what's the secret to, how do the monks stay so young? Like, I've seen 100-year-old monks here, and they look like they're 20.
Well, I'd like to think it's, if you're on the spiritual journey, if you're really seeking to love the Lord your God, I think that's what we're made for, to be children of God, to allow the Holy Spirit to touch our lives and to live in us. And I find if I can be the loving person I'm called to be, that helps me to stay young and to interact, I don't know if you're all going to Vespers. Vespers is at 5:30 today. And anyway, what we call hebdomadary is the one who starts the office with the opening verse. And then after the reading and then after the Magnificat, the hebdomadary lists intentions the community is to pray for. And in the community we say, well, hear us, O Lord. Anyway, one of the intentions I'm going to pray for today is, we keep seeing in the media the acts of violence. What was it, just in Florida? Anyway, this guy kills 5 people, with a gun. And anyway, almost daily we hear of acts of violence. And I know in Louisville, there's an awful lot of violence that goes on. But if we were to study those persons and really begin to understand their personal journeys, we'd probably find out they never experienced love very deeply. They don't feel accepted. Or something will happen where they will feel rejected, and then they become violent. And so what I'm thinking is, if we can be messengers of God's love to those around us, we will change the world in quiet ways, you know. But, you know, we have many occasions to do that. And I really, you know, I've worked with different monastic communities. I've had a chance to interact with a lot of monks. And it's just, I find again and again that it's when we fall into, you know, selfishness, or when we start to seek our own interests above those of our brothers, then we get into a conflictual situation. And anyway, that can cause all kinds of unquiet and unrest in our hearts. So we're really destined to become loving and caring persons, however young we are. And if we do that, it changes the world. You know? It changes life around us. It changes everything we do.
So there are a few young people here. What would your advice be to them? How do they start cultivating a spiritual life, growing in holiness, or just anybody that's unfamiliar with the spiritual life or loving God even?
I grew up with two brothers, and you know, I don't know what it is about brothers. They tend to like to have fights, you know. And I think, you know, if we, you know, there's always gonna, I think that, you know, we're trained early on as males to be competitive. And it's almost in our genes, I think, as males. Because, you know, from early on, you know, it was the male who protected the family. And in some ways that's healthy, you know. And there are, as much as I dislike the idea of going to war, I think there are times when you need to go to war and to protect basic human rights. And I know, like growing up, it was a brother just, and we loved one another, but we used to get into fights. In fact, my father, finally, and then my oldest brother, they fit the two of us with boxing gloves. And so we had our boxing matches, you know. And I don't know what it is, but at the same time, we've got you know, a real love for one another. And, he's 1 year older than me. And, anyways, all kinds of stories there, things, tricks I would pull on him, beating him just by tricks I would. Anyway, I think. How then, though, I just think to try to be sensitive to one another, and just to be aware, just as you want to be cared for by your brother and loved, well, you in turn want to be caring and loving to your brother. And I think if any of us, if we start with that inner disposition, desiring to be a caring and loving person, it's amazing how that can carry into every aspect of our lives, you know, everything we do. And it takes courage, you know, because I think we live in a world where there's so much competition. And even, you know, in the church and the side, you know, politically, you know, it's the polarization. You know, it's one side against the other. Instead of simply presenting what you stand for and showing your belief in it, you take a stance in opposition to the other. You know, and I feel that doesn't allow us to work together as a country. And I think it's the same in the church. You know, Pope Francis has his enemies, as those who are very critical, and it doesn't mean he doesn't make mistakes. He's admitted he's made mistakes. You know? But I think there are those who, I think, just kind of pit themselves over against Francis. And I think that's unfortunate for the church. And again, I think it's because of the tendency in our society today to see ourselves, understand ourselves in opposition to, rather than collaboration with one another. And I think what Pope Francis is trying to do with the whole synod idea is get the members of the church to be listening to one another, so that we can enrich one another's lives rather than be in opposition. I say it doesn't mean, that whoever you are, that we don't make mistakes. I know I make my mistakes, and I get upset with my brothers. But then it has to keep calling me to conversion. Keep calling me to say, hey, if I'm going to live this life, and if I'm going to be a true follower of Jesus Christ, I must learn to be a loving person, even when I'm faced with opposition. That's a struggle, but I think that's what the inner conversion is about. And what the monk's life, you asked me about the monk's life. What's at the core of it is our day is to lead us to what is called purity of heart, so that you face all of those thoughts. Living in community isn't easy, because you have all of these different monks from different backgrounds and different needs. But if we live together and are accepting of one another and do what we have to do to help the community and do it in a loving way, that leads to interior freedom, and where you can love God all day long, not just when you're standing there in choir. In fact, people don't realize, but I think I can share this. We're in choir, there we are praying to God, but there can be all kinds of stuff going on underneath. We'll find one of the brothers' voice too loud, or the person's losing pitch, or the organist is playing too fast. And anyway, all that to say, being there in choir, even though we're praying, we can have all these negative thoughts going on. But that's where you have to keep coming back to the prayer, letting the psalms be your prayer. Praying those psalms in the Spirit of Christ. And that makes all the difference, because then you can blend and be of support to the choir. But the fact that we're standing there in choir doesn't make you necessarily holy.
So what has been your biggest surprise about living in a monastery, or even being a priest?
As a monk and then as a priest.
Yeah.
The biggest surprise.
Yeah, that you didn't expect.
I didn't expect to find so much about myself. How subtle my own thinking can be. And the fact that I can get very negative and critical of a brother. And I think one of the things, living in a community, and I think it happens in family, is because you're living so close together, you can't help seeing all of the flaws, all the little shortcomings. And then you can react to them, or you can be merciful. You know? And I think it's the same with ourselves. You know, the stories about monks, you know, they go so far in the spiritual life, but then because of what they have to face about themselves, they just close down. They get preoccupied with their job, with something else that stands in the way of them growing interiorly, you know, facing what following Jesus demands of them. You know? And I think if, you know, in whatever our way of life, if we can just, again, raise our consciousness of what Jesus stands for. You know, I had the homily this morning at Mass for the Good Shepherd. And one of the things I feel, you know, we lose sight of how Jesus is in every situation. Wherever we are, whatever we are doing, we have the opportunity to reflect Christ. But we have to be open to His presence. You know, in the Gospel about the Good Shepherd, the sheep hear His voice and follow Him. You know, there's this intimate relationship between the Good Shepherd and the sheep. And I think in our own lives, it's only when we are attentive to Christ's presence in whatever we're doing, do become like Him, a child of God. You know? And that's a wonderful potential to become like Christ. You know? But we have to be attentive. You know, you have to be aware of how Christ is drawing us to be true followers. And then being a priest, what was the surprise?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things about being ordained is, you know, and again, I said this, the fact that you're ordained doesn't mean you don't have temptations. And the thing, I gave an example in the homily this morning, you know, where in the Gospel, Jesus speaks about what the strangers, the oppressors, or the you know, who steal, when they're serving their own interests in their desire to lead the flock. And I think that's very true in the political realm or in our church. And I gave the concrete example of you know, what's been going on in the church in terms of sexual abuse. You know, there's a certain percentage of priests that got involved in sexually abusing either young boys or sometimes women who come to them, you know, looking for help. And anyway, whether you're a priest or not, it means you have to continually reform your own life and integrate your sexuality. You know, we're all sexual beings, but unless you're open about what's happening in your sexual life and asking God to help you to truly be celibate, you're going to do things you shouldn't do, you know, as a celibate. And I think our sexuality, you know, again, that's true in our society. You know, there's a lot of publicity about sexual abuse in the church. But if we're honest, you know, in our society, in families, there's a lot of sexual abuse. You know, there's something like 1 in 4 women are abused at some point in their growing up. Anyway, all that to say, unless we have the help of divine grace, we won't be the priests we're supposed to be. we won't be the kind of wholesome Catholics that we're called to be. Did you hurt your wrist?
Last year, I broke my wrist.
Oh, you broke it.
The second time.
Second time. You gotta take care of yourself. Hope you didn't take it out on your brother.
Are all of the persons here priests? That is
No,
all?
we only have like 12 or 13 priests in the community. 12 or 13 out of the 36.
And what's the classification, if you will, of the others? Are they religious, but they're not priests?
No, we're all called to be monks primarily, but then at some point, if a person feels called to be a priest, he can make that known to the spiritual director or to the abbot, and then the abbot will decide whether the person should do the studies necessary to become ordained. There are a few who come. We have one monk with us, Father Raphael, who's from Rwanda, from Africa, and a very gifted man. But he came and joined us as a priest. And we're very glad to have him. He's with, we have 3 junior monks right now who are in simple vows. After 6 months of postulancy, where you just live in the community, you begin your novitiate. And then you have 2 years of novitiate where you're given special training to become a monk. And after that, you make simple vows. Then after 3 to 9 years, you make solemn vows. Anyway, he's in simple vows.
That you can be either religious or monk and not be a priest?
Oh, yeah, the majority is that. Yeah, we're really here, first of all, to be monks, persons who are truly seeking God, with all, and some, are talented, like our brother Paul, very talented, and he's got some degrees, and studied, but he never wanted to be ordained. So it's up for him to decide whether he's got that calling or not.
So in your own personal call and discernment to be to the monastic life, was it more abrupt or was it kind of years of discernment?
Discernment.
Oh,
As I pointed out, originally I was in the minor seminary for the Capuchins. And then in my 5th year in seminary, I met another seminarian. And we started talking about the spiritual life and what we saw happening, among the Capuchins. I think we were all kind of hoping the Capuchins would have a more intense spiritual life. And I must say, even in the parish where I grew up, we had Capuchins, and there were 5 or 6 in my parish. It was the days when we had lots of priests. It was a fairly large parish. Anyway, we started talking about, and then we were reading the books of, it was Raymond Flanagan. I don't know if that name rings a bell. But he wrote The Man Who Got Even with God, about one of the early monks. He was a monk himself here, Father Raymond. And he had this book, and it was popular. And so when I was in the seminary, my spiritual director, I remember he was reading Raymond's books, and then he would read Thomas Merton's book. And he was telling me how fulfilling or how encouraged he was in the spiritual life reading the books of Thomas Merton. And so I started reading Merton's books, and then the one by Father Raymond. And then he's got another one that's not Father Raymond does. Anyway, it was about the early monks that founded our monastic reform. The Cistercians are reform of the Benedictines. And anyway, he kind of encouraged me to read. My spiritual director, and then my friend was also much into reading Merton. But then when we got into reading Thomas Merton, we both became attracted to monastic life. And so the fact that we fellow seminarians in my 5th and 6th year of the seminary, we had a big influence on one another. So after my 6th year, I decided, no, I didn't want to continue with the Capuchins. I wanted to become a Cistercian. So as I say, I try to hit it. You know, was reading the autobiography of Saint Therese, her interior turn, where she's so articulate about what goes on in the human heart in terms of the struggle that goes on. And the monks, you know, the great monks of the early church, great writers about monastic life, they write a lot about the struggle of the human heart. And what's her name? My memory slips on me every now and then.
Saint Teresa of Avila. Saint Teresa of Avila.
No, I read her too, and she had a real big impact on me. But no, this is a living sister. Her book is Thoughts Matter, is one of them. Anyway, she gets into detail. She's read a lot about the early monks and what the monastic spirituality. And what she gets into is the thoughts that arise in the human heart. You know, all the angry thoughts, the lustful thoughts, the possessive, you want to possess things, own things, envy, Anyway, she goes into some detail about the different thoughts. Anyway, but the monk, if the monk is really serious about the spiritual life, he learns to face those thoughts going on in the human heart, because they are what control us. They decide on how we act each day. But if we're in touch with those thoughts, when they arise, you recognize them, and you can tell yourself, "Oh, I don't want to go there. This is selfish. This is, against what I'm about in terms of learning purity of heart."
So throughout your entire monastic life, have you ever had the temptations to leave the monastery to go back into the world?
Yeah, there have been times.
Not every day.
No, not every day. And you learn a lot about monastic community just by living with the brothers you live with. And I've known a lot of monks who've been here 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. I've seen some who've been here 30 years and decided to leave, And, there's something about commitment that's so important for any of our lives, And, and I think it's the same in married life today. There's something like 50% of marriages, they don't hold together, they break up. And so, there always comes that time when and it could be that you're being led somewhere else to do something different. But if you're really being led by God then you will talk to the right people who can be honest with you. You know, and an important aspect of monastic life is having a good spiritual director. Someone who will tell you as it is, you know, who can really speak to you, with whom you can be open and really share what's going on, and then willing to listen to his advice, or willing to really pray with the advice he gives. And if you're being led somewhere else, you will know that through your spiritual director. Then you can do something different. But normally, you know, after, you know, it takes a number of years before you would actually commit yourself to this life. During that time, you have a novice director, and then a junior director, and then you will have a spiritual director, you know, someone you choose in the community to talk about your spiritual life. Well, if you're doing that, you will know what God's asking of you. And it'll be clear in terms of what you need to do.
Do you know sign language?
Sign language? Oh yeah, I still remember. I still remember some of it, but we used to, that was a whole big experience for a lot of monks, you know. And, you know, the emphasis, monks are to be silent, you know, and get it, so you can be attentive to Christ's presence in your life and be listening to how the Spirit is guiding you. But if you're talking all the time, you won't be very attentive. But, you know, so we had sign language, but monks got really good at it, you know. And so I remember I was here, and I was going over to do some work. Anyway, I was going over to work, and there were a couple monks making sign language, you know. Well, a half hour later, I came back, and they were still doing sign language. And so I could help, that's defeating the purpose. And you can even, you know, once you get good at the signs, it's amazing what a conversation you can go on. Because if you're good at signs, you don't need words, and you can actually communicate more rapidly and carry on a more intense kind of conversation than if you actually spoke. So at one point we decided that within the monastery we will have, you know, important areas where no one is to speak, but then certain other areas where if you need to communicate, you're free to do that, to talk with one of the brothers. And then if you have a friend, a spiritual friend, that you want to get to know and share with, you can take a walk. You wouldn't go out in this weather. You can take a long walk, or you can sit, you know, and there's a couple areas where, you know, you can go to rooms where you can go and have conversation. And so there's the possibility of real friendships in the community is real. Discipline needed, and there is some restraint, and I think you can offer it for that.
I read many years ago, St. Bernard and his brothers, and I thought that was part of their rule, and that was that for reparation, for people.
I guess I've never heard it stated that way in terms of reparation for oral communication or non-communication. I think it is saying, you know, to the public, and we have to be careful with the use of our words. You know, that they're communicating good news and not bad news. You know?
Yeah, I told a lady at work one, because she was saying stuff that wasn't necessary. I said, good angels carry good news. she come back about an hour later and said, I don't want to be a bad angel. So what we use our tongue for does matter.
Yeah, exactly. No, we could do a lot of harm with that tongue. And we can hurt others. It's known that people's reputation can be ruined. So yeah, it is a call to be aware of how we use our words. And again, it is all, it starts with our thoughts. Words express our thoughts. And again, if monks are really attentive to their thoughts, then often enough they won't say things they shouldn't say. But it assumes you're attentive to your thoughts. Again, that's why I think the life we're trying to live is so important. It's creating the inner quiet where we can be attentive to what's going on, not only in our heads, but in our hearts. And if we are attentive, then we can avoid pursuing those thoughts or those movements of the heart that are harmful, either to ourselves or to others.
So we're at about 5:10. If anybody has to leave to get home before the weather. So you said Vespers is at 5:30, correct?
5:30.
So we're about 20 minutes away from that. We can kind of have a discussion at the end of this as we're waiting. But are there any last questions?
Father, you were talking about the spiritual direction among the monastic life here. What about the laity? Do you suggest that
I think it could be a very good thing.
And do you offer that here to the outside or not?
I do, and I do know there are a number in the community that are help in terms of giving spiritual direction.
So you think that would be beneficial though for anyone?
Yeah, I'm dealing now with a number of persons, in terms of spiritual direction. I do
That are not within the monastery?
Yeah, they're
Okay.
not monks. They're from other church backgrounds. And I'm glad to do that. I don't like to get into too much of it, because again, to keep the balance in the life. And that is another thing about our life. It's maintaining a balance between our office or our prayer, which is the vocal prayer, the offices, and then the interior prayer. Monks need also to be just quiet and meditate and do spiritual reading. And that's the second one, is the monks need to have their prayer, and then their what we call Lectio Divina, time that they take each day to read from an authentic author, someone who has a truly spiritual life. It could be St. Bernard. One of the monks I've liked a lot is William of St. Thierry. He was a Benedictine who became a Cistercian. Anyway, I find his spirituality very enriching. And I've read St. Aelred of Rivaux, I've read Teresa of Avila. I've had opportunity over the years to read St. Augustine. In fact, when I first came here, my junior master was Father John Hughes, and he had me read as much as Augustine I could. Well, I didn't read all of Augustine, but close to it, actually. Anyway, that's good. But spiritual direction, I do encourage that. There are a lot of spiritual, again, you want someone who's got some appreciation or some depth in their spiritual life. they're going to do good spiritual direction, but I think it can actually be very helpful. And I think, you know, in between married couples, I actually think if, as I've told a number of people, I think one of the in giving spiritual direction, one of the best things I've found out is if you can lead a person to really talk about the things that matter to them. If you can get them, the things they're struggling with, if you can get them to get it out on the table, so to speak, they know what they need to do. I don't have to give direction, but I need to help them get it out on the table. And I think that's so, and I think in married couples, you know, if they're really open and honest with one another, with what's going on in their struggles, I just think that can be a spiritual direction. You know, again, it's being open about what you're struggling with can make all the difference. Well, I think I'm going to leave you on. I like to go up to Vespers a little ahead of time.
Yep.
Get myself to quiet down. Anyway, it's been good sharing with you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sure. No, my privilege.
You're a priest, right?
Yes, I am.
Maybe we have your blessing.
Okay. Loving God, we thank you for this time and for our sharing. Bless each and all of my brothers and sisters, and help us all to come to that fullness of life that you have promised. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father. So yes, everyone's welcome to join Father Michael at Vespers and hear him sing. Hear him do some singing.
Well, I hope I don't